Hello, welcome to iWist Studios Stories and Politics Season 1, and I'm glad to host you, but before I continue, please subscribe to my YouTube channel for more biographies. The Rise and Fall of Emperor Bokassa I, the tragic story of the Central African Empire. The story of Jean Bedel Bokassa, also known as Emperor Bokassa I, is a tale of ambition, brutality, extravagance, and ultimately, a dramatic downfall. His rise to power and the creation of the Central African Empire remain one of the most infamous chapters in the history of the Central African Republic. Born on February 22, 1921, in the French colony of French Equatorial Africa, what is now the Central African Republic, Bokassa's early life seemed far removed from the grandeur of empire. But through cunning, force, and a complete disregard for human rights, he managed to transform himself into one of the most controversial rulers in modern African history. Early life and military career. Bokassa was born to a modest family in the small village of Babangui, in the Ubangar region, now part of the Central African Republic. His childhood was marked by poverty and a lack of formal education, but his determination and drive were apparent from a young age. At the age of 18, Bokassa left home and joined the French colonial army in 1939, just as World War II was breaking out. During the war, he fought for the French and gained some recognition for his bravery. His time in the French military allowed him to rise through the ranks, eventually reaching the position of sergeant major. After the war, Bokassa remained in the French army, serving in French colonies in Africa, and eventually returned to his homeland after the Central African Republic gained independence from France in 1960. He was appointed to the Central African military and quickly became involved in politics. The coup of 1966 and rise to power. In 1966, the Central African Republic was still finding its footing as an independent nation. At the time, David Dacko, Bokassa's cousin, was serving as president. However, Dacko's government faced numerous challenges, including economic instability, ethnic tensions, and widespread corruption. Discontent with Dacko's rule was growing, and in a dramatic twist of fate, Jean Bedel Bokassa saw an opportunity to seize power. On the morning of January 1, 1966, with the backing of the military and his own ambitions driving him, Bokassa launched a coup that overthrew President Dacko. He quickly assumed control of the country, establishing himself as the new head of state. At the time, many saw him as a patriotic leader who could guide the country to prosperity. However, it didn't take long before his true nature as a ruler began to show. The authoritarian rule of Bokassa. Once in power, Bokassa wasted no time in consolidating his control. In 1972, he dissolved the country's constitution and established a one-party system, with himself at the top as the ultimate authority. His style of leadership was deeply authoritarian, marked by political repression, censorship, and a complete disregard for democratic principles. Bokassa's government was notorious for its brutal treatment of political opponents. He had little tolerance for dissent and frequently used violence to suppress any opposition. Political rivals were imprisoned, tortured, or simply executed. His government was also marked by an overwhelming cult of personality. He often compared himself to the great kings of Africa and sought to present himself as the savior of the nation. The creation of the Central African Empire. In 1976, Bokassa took an even bolder step to solidify his power and elevate his status. In a move that shocked the world, he declared the creation of the Central African Empire and crowned himself Emperor Bokassa I on December 4, 1977. This decision was not just a power grab, it was an attempt to establish a monarchical dynasty similar to those that existed in Europe and ancient Africa. To mark this occasion, Bokassa staged one of the most lavish coronation ceremonies the world had ever seen. It was held in the capital, Bangui, and was a spectacle of unimaginable opulence. The ceremony cost an estimated $20 million, an astronomical sum, especially in a country where poverty was widespread and many people struggled to survive. The emperor's robes were made of gold, and the coronation was attended by dignitaries from across the world, including French officials, who had long supported Bokassa's rule. However, this display of extravagance was met with intense criticism both domestically and internationally. While Bokassa basked in his newfound imperial glory, his people suffered. The money spent on the coronation could have been used to improve the country's struggling economy or address the widespread poverty, but instead, it symbolized the emperor's ego and lavish lifestyle. His rule became increasingly disconnected from the harsh realities facing the nation. A reign of excess and brutality. Bokassa's reign was one of excess. He had multiple wives, reports vary, but it's estimated that he married at least 5 women. His personal lifestyle was a stark contrast to the lives of most Central Africans. While the population lived in poverty, Bokassa spent extravagantly on luxury items, imported goods, and lavish palaces. But it wasn't just his indulgence that made his rule notorious, it was also the brutality with which he ruled. The most infamous example of his ruthlessness came in 1979 when he ordered the massacre of hundreds of school children who had protested against the high cost of mandatory school uniforms. The children were protesting because their parents could not afford the uniforms, and in retaliation, Bokassa's troops shot and killed many of them. The true number of victims remains unclear, but estimates range from hundreds to over 1,000. Bokassa's cruelty was not limited to the children. He maintained a regime of terror, and reports emerged of widespread torture, forced labor, and summary executions. The emperor's security forces operated with impunity, carrying out brutal crackdowns against anyone who dared challenge his rule. The fall of Bokassa. By the late 1970s, Bokassa's regime was facing increasing pressure. Despite his attempts to modernize the country, the economy remained in shambles, and the suffering of the people continued. International criticism of his reign grew, and even France, his longtime ally, began to distance itself from him. In 1979, with the help of France and a coalition of military leaders, Bokassa's regime was overthrown in a coup. His cousin, David Dacko, was restored to the presidency. Bokassa fled into exile, first to France, where he lived in relative obscurity for several years. He was unable to regain his power or influence in the Central African Republic, despite his continued attempts. The world had grown tired of the emperor's excesses and brutality, and the dreams of his imperial reign crumbled. Later years and death. In 1986, Bokassa was allowed to return to the Central African Republic after being granted a pardon. However, his time in the spotlight was over. In 1993, Bokassa was put on trial for crimes committed during his reign, including the massacre of school children. He was acquitted of most charges, but the trial further tarnished his legacy. Jean-Bedel Bokassa lived the final years of his life in quiet obscurity. He never regained the power or wealth he once had, and he died on November 3, 1996, at the age of 75, reportedly from a heart attack. Legacy and conclusion. Bokassa's legacy is one of cruelty, misrule, and extravagant excess. His brief reign as Emperor of the Central African Empire was marked by some of the worst abuses of power in modern African history. He tried to create an empire based on grandeur and opulence, but his rule left a nation in shambles. To this day, his name is associated with dictatorship and tyranny, and his reign serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the devastating consequences of personal ambition. While some may argue that Bokassa's attempt to modernize the Central African Republic had a vision, his methods and disregard for human life ensured that his rule remains one of the darkest periods in the country's history. In the end, the story of Emperor Bokassa is a tragic reminder that the hunger for power, when coupled with cruelty and excess, can destroy not only an individual but an entire nation.